Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Real Estate Development Insights podcast, where we bring you ideas, experiences, and insights about the real estate development industry. My name is Payam Nursalahi, and I'm your host here. My guest for this episode is Rod. Rod Robotham is the principal and president of One Space Unlimited, which is an architectural and interior design firm located in GTA. They work a lot all over Canada, but mostly in Toronto and GTA. They have a second office in Calgary, which has recently opened. And Rod and I have a candid discussion about different stages of a development project, from pre-con to design development, or prior to that, some of the approvals, and also the construction phase. And the main point of this whole conversation revolves around the relationships that the developer or the development team forms and maintains with their consultant team, which is a critical part of their core team. And Rod has a lot of good pointers and tools of the trades when it comes to dealing with the architects, what items to keep in mind, what are some of the best practices, and overall how to make sure your entire team, especially or specifically in this context, your consultant team is working together and they're all rowing in the same direction. And we talk about the role of the developers in addressing the housing crisis and how we can potentially help. And as always, if you want to learn more about Rod and their company or more information about this episode, please go to our website, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. That's all one phrase. I hope you enjoy listening to this podcast episode, and please remember to subscribe to the show. Thank you very much. Hey, Rod.
Hey, how are you? I'm good. How are you?
Awesome. Thank you for being here. I appreciate your time.
Sure.
It's been a while. You and I haven't worked too closely for the past few years, but nevertheless, we've kept in touch, and I appreciate you being here.
Oh, I'm happy to do it.
Time.
Yeah.
Why don't we start by you telling us, our audience, a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you work, what you do on a daily basis, and then we dive in from there.
Okay. Since 2000, I've been the president and owner of One Space Unlimited, Inc. We offer architectural and interior design services to the general public. And I would say that the majority of our work is in the hospitality and multifamily residential industries, meaning hotels, but also condominiums and rental projects and low-rise and high-rise and mid-rise projects of all shapes across Canada. We have now got two offices, one here in Toronto and the other one's located in Calgary.
So I didn't know that.
Yeah. So we just opened that one in April of this year. So we're excited about the possibilities.
That's great. Let's talk about the client relationship and obviously the other consultants and everyone being in the same room trying to achieve the same results, right?
Yeah.
What we're trying to do in this podcast and as part of all of the content that we're creating is try to facilitate the way for new developers that are coming from other spaces and other environments and other business roles per se.
Right.
And trying to create a framework or a map or a guideline, if you may, in terms of what are the best practices in terms of going through the development process, right?
Right.
And with all the changes that have recently happened in Toronto, GTA, and for that matter, most of Canada, with the housing crisis, the supply shortage, and some favorable changes that I want to say has been happening with the legislation and regulations from the government and different multiple levels. I believe that we're going to see more of these entrepreneurs coming into the mix from different industries. Let's start with this. If you were to talk to, obviously you've been doing this for a long time and in a role that I want to say is a primary role of consultants, right? You're probably, if not the first one, you're probably between the first or second one who gets the call when a developer wants to start a project.
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah.
Yeah. So with that said, what would be like the three top decisions or three different phases or mental models that a new developer needs to have?
That's a good question. And I have met many of them. And I have observations that I think they would benefit from because I do see a repeating pattern that a lot of new developers tend to repeat, that if I can step in and try to say to them, you might want to pay attention to this particular thing and not the way you're thinking, I certainly will offer it. And I think it starts from just assembling the right team And this is like any sport franchise. The more successful that team has been put together and the more specific the roles are and the more concise those roles are defined, the better off you can set yourself up for a successful team to deliver a successful project. And the owner or the clients, they have a role to play in here. But if you think about the sort of the timeline of how things happen, the first real issue is once that team is put together, and what might start out with us and a planning consultant and maybe a development manager or whatever resources that the in-house or whatever resources the client has available to them as an in-house resource, that team will begin to assemble and start to put together a framework for what is the design program. And this is where new developers have to take the first step with their consultant team to set the direction for the development. They say to us, here's my site. I'm not sure, but I would like to obtain zoning or site plan approval to build the following. And they don't have to be that precise, but they say, listen, it's got to be, oh no, we're thinking 8 to 10 stories. We're thinking about 130 units. And they've done this because they have obviously put together some kind of a preliminary pro forma that's driving these numbers. And that's important. You got to start out with a profit. So make sure you do your homework on the site, the soil conditions, maybe the existing zoning before you even assemble that team. But let's assume that it's done. The first observation that I can pass on is that although most municipalities in Ontario and even as far away as Alberta, their processes are similar. They do vary a little bit and they're very linear. Okay. So you start out with a little drawing package that we would prepare and you apply for what's called a pre-consultation or a development application review or something like that. They always have different names, but in general, it's referred to a pre-consultation meeting. And that meeting really is just a way to test your hypothesis, so to speak, and to say, okay, we want to build a building of 8 to 9 floors, so many units, like the owner said, with the input of the planning consultant prior to that application process. We come up with the concept and it's typically reviewed. Nowadays, the meetings are online and the municipalities will they don't provide permission. They'll provide here's what you will need to do if you move forward commentary. And from there, they prepare a report that you get a hold of after they're done with the review. They circulate the report and it says things in it like, you will need a rezoning application and you will need to submit the following plans and you need to submit the following reports along with that rezoning application. What it won't say is we guarantee you that you will get what you're asking for.
There's nothing guaranteed.
Never. We have to remember that municipalities are driven by politics, and when the politics change, so too can the temperature for development. And I've seen many a developer say, we should meet with the councillor first. Okay. We should meet with the mayor first. We should meet with the planning department first. These people are representatives of a municipal body that have some role to play, but none of them really will give you a guarantee, and none of them can really say, you know what, I think you should go for more. You should do this. They offer what is more likely a personal opinion or some guidance. Not that it's a bad idea to talk to these people. I don't think it is, but you just have to be careful that the process is one thing and the people who play a part in the process is another. And what you really should do is focus more on the process and less on the back door or back room.
The importance.
Yeah.
You should put the importance on the process itself
Yeah.
because it's going to outsurvive the person.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And once you get this pre-consultation done, you certainly end up dealing with all the people that were on that phone call. So you're better off to pay attention to them.
Right.
And this is where I can tell you a lot of developers that are new to the industry also can get caught up in the, yeah, but I need more. There's plenty of projects that you can build and make money on. It's not just about gross floor area. It's not just about maximizing the unit count. It's about building something where your cost and your profit vary by about 10%. You can build a 9-story building and you can be in and out of the process in, I don't know, maybe a year and a half, 2 years, or you can try to get 15 and you'll be there for 3 years. And you might end...
Just to be clear, by the process you're talking about, from the minute you have the pre-con meeting to the minute to the point that you have the permit.
I would say zoning.
Is that what you're...
Zoning. Now, this is the other thing. The timeline expectations are somewhat questionable. We've had many a timeline given to us in the GTHA, Brampton, Toronto, Mississauga, where they will say rezonings on average between 8 to 14 months. Okay. And then smaller municipalities, like we're dealing with a project that's, I guess it's 10 stories in Belleville. And they said that their process is 4 months long. So I was very happy to hear that number because we don't hear that number very often. But I think
it depends how busy they are.
Well, how busy they are, how robust their processes may be, how much care they are taking in assembling the city in the right way. Certainly when you get a metropolis like anything like Toronto or Mississauga, et cetera, many applications are coming in all at once. Many. And they're trying to put the city together in the right way. Okay, so they have to make sure that they're balancing all of these things like services and transportation and where are the schools located. They're doing a more careful, detailed analysis. Other municipalities, they might not have the same level of construction happening in those communities. So, of course, they may not be as busy, but they're also looking at more vacant land that has the possibility for development.
Room to potentially fix things down the road than something in Toronto, right?
Yes.
That's basically what it comes down to. If you're in Toronto, you have to be very careful. Everyone's watching more, and they're like you're setting precedents for other things that might happen based on the single decision you make today. Hey, you're right. Like those things makes it complicated. It makes the approval process, the zoning and site plan approvals pretty complicated.
And quite frankly, as citizens of a large city, we want them to be careful. We want them to take their time. We want them to make sure that things are balanced out. Privacy. If my house is next door to a proposal for 20 stories, I'm going to be concerned about it. I'm going to be concerned about traffic. And we want them to take their time and make sure that this is somewhat inclusive. At the same time, it can't be so onerous that it holds us all up, which is, I think, the key underlying factor behind our housing crisis is the length of time. So once you're through your zoning application, of course, you then have to switch gears to go to something which is more technical in nature, and that's called a site plan approval application. And that gets right down to not only the floor area, like GFA, unit count, building height, how does the fire truck service a building, how does a garbage truck get in and out, make sure you have enough bins for recycling versus organic waste and I guess other waste. But it all comes down to that level. And that at that point, then they start to talk about the materiality of the building. And it can be...
Sorry, Rod, I'm just going to interrupt you here for a second, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Because I want to recap. I know we're covering a lot of ground that is going to happen in a long time, but I want to just make sure we get it all compact together. Basically, I'm starting a new project. Like you mentioned, my first step is to go do your homework. Figure out the direction you want to go, at least within 10-15% of your eventual target.
Yeah. Make sure you've got your return.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You figure out where you want to go. Put together the right team based on that typical outcome. And I want to open one bracket here and say, and I'm going to ask you to chime in as well, that the right team, are we saying people who have done similar things or similar scale projects or similar type projects within the 10-15% range, right? Is that what we mean by assembling the right team? Because I think that's a very key point to talk about as well.
Yeah, you're right. Obviously, the members of that team have to have the right experience. They have to be well matched. I've seen a lot of times where developers will bring an architect or a consultant along who's had something to do with maybe housing, but at a very small scale. And all of a sudden, you're asking them to do something that's 15 to 20 stories. It doesn't always work well. It's a different part of the building code. It's a different level of life safety. It's a different level of responsibility to the general public. And you really have to extend beyond the four walls and the four property lines. And you have to start thinking about how the building meets the urban design guidelines of the city and everything else. And it is a significant undertaking. So it is wise for an owner to check the references of any particular consultant they want to engage for the project.
I think going back to what you said, that 10-15% margin is probably where you want to be. So if you have a team that has worked on let's say 5-story, they can probably do another 8-story, but you don't want to go from a single family team to building a 12-story building. That's too much of a gap, right?
It is a gap.
And based on, sorry.
Yeah, it's a gap because those consultants get challenged and they're learning on the job. As an owner, I wouldn't want to be paying somebody to do that because I'm looking at my costs, my timing, my schedule. When I want to get this project in the ground, I don't have time to train somebody as an owner. And that would be my thinking on it. Yeah. And
that's also, I think it's also not fair for them, right? Because I know sometimes when you work with someone that, like yourself, who has done a 20-story building, a 15-story building before, a lot of questions are already answered, or the learning curve, you're much further down the curve, if you may.
Yep.
Or ahead on the curve, if you may.
Yep.
And it's also, this doesn't put too much pressure on the consultant team to catch up, right? They already know which strings to pull and which ones not to touch.
Yep.
Right?
100%.
Okay, so we get the right team. We get the right team in order. We start talking to the city. We basically, like you said, we listen, pay attention, figure out what we can push back. And you touched on something that I think it's worth repeating and maybe even worth expanding on, because I see it on my side as well, which is more is not necessarily always better.
Yes.
Like you talk about a project and you go, like if we want to get technical, you go from 6-story, less than 18 meters in Ontario here, to something that goes above that. All of a sudden, for, 5,000 more square feet or even 10,000 more square feet, all of a sudden you're changing the category of the building, you're adding a whole bunch of complexities, and you might on paper see, marginally improved returns, but in real life, to your point, your approvals take that much longer. Your consultants are that much more challenged. And frankly, from my perspective on the construction side, your risks are that much more because now you have more eyes watching you. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, completely. And, I think when I look at projects, I look at it and I give it the first blush and I go, does this make sense at this height in this location? Yes. No, I'm not sure. And it is something that you have to look at because, like I said, you have to go beyond the four walls of the building. You have to go outside the property line and you have to really see and then say to yourself, this is a good fit. This isn't just a inward focused exercise on maxing out everything. You really do have to be cognizant of, is it a good fit? Because at some point down the line, you've got a brand as a developer. And That's true. Whenever you produce a building, you're producing your product. So your product is a reflection of your brand. And the key thing there is to be reasonable with the expectation and at the same time, be willing to work cooperatively with municipalities. As soon as you put yourself on the opposite side of the table and you're an adversary, you're going to spend more time. And time is money. Unless you have significantly deep pockets, you can't really float in perpetuity. You've got to come to a point where, I got a return on investment I got to look at. And if this extra 10,000 square feet, 2 floors is really going to help me out, then I'll put my time and money in that. But if you get dragged out to the point where, you're 2 years in and you're still paying carrying costs on your land, you got to think it through.
It's not worth it. Probably not worth it.
Probably not. But we're seeing things fluctuate quite a bit where sometimes that risk is worth it. And sometimes you see applications coming back and they are higher, bigger.
Right.
And they do get approved. But the developer takes that risk. They go to sleep with it and they wake up with it every morning. Or sometimes every night too. But they take the risk on assessing how far they want to go. And that's a serious risk.
I guess that's probably, if not the biggest or most important decision a developer needs to make, at least from my point of view, is one of the top 2 or 3 is where to stop. Like you keep pushing, you go back and forth.
Yeah.
At some point, you need to commit to a concept at the very least, and say, okay, this is it. Let's just take it to the next level, which now I'm going to ask you to elaborate on that. So we got the zoning in place. We have an understanding of site plan, or we are going through that. Maybe walk us through that. What are the key elements that we should look out for, or a new developer should consider? Or at least ask the right questions.
In site plan approval?
And afterwards. Correct.
Okay. So once all the rezoning application gives you is the permission to use the land for this intended use. So provided you are in substantial accordance with that rezoning bylaw, which typically is a specific document applicable now to your site, then you are next on the path to site plan approval, which is a more technical dive into the building. And that's where you can really start to, if it's a condominium, for example, you can really start to dive into the design program more. And that is, what do the units look like? What does the ground floor look like? What do the amenity spaces look like? At that point, because of this design program expansion, your team grows. So you'll need structural, mechanical, electrical engineers. You might need acoustic engineers. You might need more that you weren't necessary for the simple use of the land or land use approval. What now you need is a larger team that's basically focusing their attention on designing the building from the 4 property walls or 4 property lines and the 4 walls of the building in. So that's when it gets more technical. At the same time, I think the key thing for the developers here is to be patient. When you submit an application for site plan approval, they will come back with at least 2 to 3 rounds of commentary using whatever system of approval that they use or are authorized to use with the provincial government's changes and so on, and know that it's going to take time. They can give you a round of comments after 3 or 4 months, and then you make the adjustments or whatever it is you need to do. You resubmit, and they can make another set of comments, but they might now add something and say, we'd like you to do another study. We'd like you to do something else. Okay. Everybody gets their back up when this happens. It's human nature, right? Because
unfortunately, that's very common.
Yeah, and it is common. And look, these guys are just trying to do their job in the municipalities. They're trying to support the application. They're trying to bring it forward. They're trying to get your approval. You just have to be patient. It is human nature to get frustrated by the process. And I think it's frustrating for everybody equally, including the municipal staff, as much as it is the private sector. And a lot of time and a lot of money can go into this process. But it's just something that if I was the developer, I would say, okay, I know it's going to be a rough ride. It's like getting prepared for winter driving. You know there's a snowstorm coming. You're prepared for it. You've got all what you need to do. You're driving carefully. You're being patient with the drivers around you. And you can go on the path, patiently go through it and get to the other end. And don't get involved emotionally. Remain objective.
Yeah, that's true.
And don't get engaged emotionally. That's just not going to help you much. I've seen that.
And I think that's one thing you just mentioned, which also ties back to this emotional comment of yours.
Yeah.
I think there's a misconception, if you may, that the city or the municipalities are just trying to throw stones at you or trying to be roadblocks.
Yeah.
Personally, I don't think that's the case. I do think the processes are not as efficient as they can be. I don't think that the guidelines are as clear as they need to be or as streamlined as they need to be. But at the same time, like you said, we're entrusting the future of our cities and municipalities to these people who are, by definition, competent and qualified to do what they do. So it just takes a little bit longer. And to your point, if you're receiving a comment, and I know at least I deal with this probably on a daily basis or on different projects, that we go back and we say, listen, you're asking for this. And I know the bylaw is asking for that dimension on that corner, but why? Can we work together and see if we can shave it by 0.2 meters?
Yeah.
And that solves a problem for us and you. And many times it just comes back and say, you know what? Yeah, we can. Like, it's just a minor adjustment. right?
It's how you work together that makes the difference. And we've had projects where tight urban site and so on, we get together with the urban designers and the urban planners and so on at the city side. And we say, listen, guys, what can we achieve here together? Here's what the owner's trying to do. Okay. And you work with them. They're colleagues. You know, some of them went to school with you maybe. So they're colleagues. So let's try to get this through with the focus on the return on investment to happen as quickly as possible, but also be realistic. And we've had those exchanges successfully where they said to us, why don't you add an extra story to the building? Use that top floor as amenity. Why don't you expand this part closer to this setback? As much as we have this preconceived notion that somehow antagonistic and they're there to say no, and it's like visiting the Wizard of Oz for something, they're there to also try to help you because this is what they're professionally trained to do. So I know that's true. That sometimes it gets missed, and I have to remind clients of that. I think that there's also times when the process can get silly, where they are telling us as the designers what color of brick, what size of brick. I think that gets a little bit too far into my area of expertise, and they should be trusting that judgment as much as I'm trying to trust there. Yeah, that can be a bit onerous. And that's when the clients typically get very upset.
And I think there's another somewhat, it's very slow, but somewhat positive shift that I'm seeing also happening is that understanding the shortage on the supply and the housing crisis, I think the general perspective of the evil developer is getting less common. I know there are a lot of people out there that are still not very fond of developers.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think one of our previous guests on the podcast was saying that many of these developers are providing a service essentially to the community by doing this and taking a lot of risk. And it's no different than any other entrepreneur, but this one is just more significant, and the magnitude of it is just more visible to the community and the cities. It just takes that much more hits.
I agree 100%. I constantly am defending the developer in front of various parties and really reminding them, listen, try a world without them. Okay. Who's going to take the risk? These guys take such enormous risk with what they're doing for 10% profit over 5-6 years, maybe you're investing into a 25-story building, 30-story building. It might be a 5-year time frame before anybody gets to move in. This is not
a risk.
Yeah. And this is not shy of risk. This is big stuff. And here's the other thing. Everybody who's living in a building out there is benefiting from that risk. Everybody. Somebody built a house where there wasn't any. Somebody put a building where there wasn't one. Somebody added floors that you now live on. We all have benefited from that over the last 200 years. This housing crisis across the country, and I do say across the country, is a significant one, and it needs to be addressed. I'm on the phone with people who are on the East Coast saying that in Prince Edward Island, we have a housing problem. They want to do 5 or 6 buildings to address it. And then you get into Ontario, definitely well-known story. You get it to Calgary, it's the same problem. Small towns outside of Toronto, it's the same problem. Housing crisis. Yeah.
And what this hopefully these new developers and entrepreneurs are going to bring is a somewhat decentralized system of supply, which is acting on their ingenuity and their risk taking and their entrepreneurship and creativity, creating more of these buildings that we obviously need. And I just want to move on in the design phase. Are there any key questions or directions or pointers that you think a developer should give the design team or keep asking the design team during the design development?
Okay, so the first thing is that whenever I encounter someone who's doing, let's say, a 10-story building or something like that as their first building, I say to them, okay, I'm going to tell you everything I know. I'm going to make recommendations. You get to decide whether or not those are any good for your particular business plan. And I would encourage you to listen to the consultants the same way. And I also think that the consultants need to answer every question you have, no matter how silly you think it is, because you're learning something that is just not written down somewhere where you pick up a book and it's, 50 pages on how to be a developer. There isn't such a thing. And
True.
so you really have to, you have to be able to feel free to ask your questions of your consultant team. You pay for them. At the same time, I remind these consultants on occasion, guys, please be patient in answering the question, because I know that we do it 20 times a year. We just say, rezoning SPA. And then we start building. There's lots of people who are doing this for the first time, and they're the boss.
They pay the bill.
Yeah. So show some patience. And I think it's got to be a two-way street. The consultants have to listen and answer those questions. And the owner also has to feel like they can. I've had clients sitting in a consultant meeting that didn't ask any questions. And then after everyone leaves, they say to me, what that guy said, I didn't understand it. And I said, well, you got to say something. He works for you. It's like when you go to a doctor, they speak a language that we don't necessarily understand at times. So we go, okay, just tell me what that means. And professionals have their own dialogue, particularly in this field. And mechanical engineer sitting there and he's saying, we could use heat pumps, we can use a 3-pipe or 4-pipe fan coil system. Some people are going to hear that for the first time and go, okay, there's a difference in cost and there's a difference in other things like how big it is, and the maintenance afterwards and so on. Just take the time, ask the questions. And I like to remind the consultants that this is a major investment, and somewhere along the line, this developer has taken risk, and their neck is on the line, and the livelihood of their family is likely on the line, and we have a duty to serve.
But if you don't mind, I'm going to take a step even further.
Okay.
And like you said, as a consultant or as someone who's dealing in this business, we go through these things quite a bit, like quite often, like you mentioned, maybe 20 times a year.
Yeah.
And sometimes we get so ingrained in the role of a consultant rather than, I think sometimes I look at I take part in these meetings and I'm thinking, at some point you need to act like a coach rather than consultant.
Yeah.
And say, listen, here's the heat pump, here's the two-pipe fan coil, here's the VRF, here's the 4-pipe. But if I were you for this type of project, it is between these two, and you might want to think about the other one. To your point, not too many people do this on a daily basis. Part of that, I want to say, has to do with the curse of knowledge, when you know something and you assume everyone else knows the same thing.
Yeah.
And the second part has to do with the fact that a lot of us do deal with experienced developers, which don't need that extra coaching, if you may, right? So
True.
I think there's room for that as well on this smaller projects.
Well, on the smaller projects with inexperienced or rarely experienced, I guess, and if they've just, maybe this is their first or second project, you have to read the room. You have to look at what are they risking, and you almost have to feel it. And you have to think, if I was in his position or her position, I would want to know more about certain things. You just double check. Okay, is this clear? Are you understanding this? Yes. Not to treat them like they're 5 years old, but you want to make sure, are you understanding this?
Not.
Because I think that when we take a car in for repair, we might ask the mechanic more questions than we do someone who's building an $80 million building for us. Does that make sense to you? Because I don't get it. I think it's okay that you take your time and you make sure you hear them. A coach is a good way to say it, but also to think like a business person. Just think, if I had $80 million, I'd never done this before. I know the funding's going to come from there, whatever, but somebody's putting out $2 million up front to get this thing to move. That's not inexpensive.
It's not pocket change.
No, but it's in the client's best interest to know this, and it really is incumbent upon them to be responsible enough to be educated. So if they have to ask the questions, they really need to make sure that they're asking them, and don't be worried about.
Ask the questions. I guess what we were saying is that ask the questions if you're new to this game. And also, I want to, again, top it off by saying that if you're selecting the team, try to select a team that's willing to give you that extra mile of coaching and attention, that has the bandwidth, because that's another thing. Many times when we go through this early phase of hiring consultants on projects, you go out for RFPs, you get proposals, you get numbers, and typically the cheapest number that comes back is the busiest one, which you don't get a hold of later on. So that's something to be mindful of.
Yes, I would say that's correct. The way I put it is, when I meet with clients for the first time, regardless of what level of experience they have, the first thing I typically ask is, so what is your experience with the architectural world? Mm-hmm. What is your number one thing that, you would love to change? If we were to work together, what would you love to not happen? And the response times, the coordination issues are the two top things that most experienced developers will inevitably offer. New time guys don't necessarily know because they say, I don't know, I'm looking for a really good design. I'm looking for something that makes me the money that I need in my performance so I get my return on investment. But I say to them, okay, we're going to be together for 6 or 7 years. And it's like having a two-way trust in communication. So I need to be able to speak my mind to you, and you sure as heck should and will speak your mind to me. And there will be mistakes along the way. Everybody has them. But it's how we're going to address them that makes the difference. And it's so much built-in business thinking goes into what I do for them. And I try to offer them things like very efficient buildings with net to gross square foot ratios that are 83 to 85% and optimized spans between shear walls or demising walls if it's not poured concrete. And I tell them, these are the goals that we're going to try to achieve together, and ask your questions. And we're going to be together a long time. So let's make sure we manage that relationship very effectively. Just tell me what's on your mind at all times. It's very important.
So if I want to flip that, if you're a new developer and you're starting the process and you're interviewing, let's say, the key team players, like architect is definitely one of the key team players, because we're going to end up having 20, 30 different consultants. Not all of them will have the same impact on the success or failure of the project.
Yeah.
I guess what you're saying is that I'm going to go to an architect and I'm going to ask a few questions to gauge myself and see. One is I want to envision myself that can I sit down with this guy for 6, 7 years and potentially share some meals and have the discussions and have heated discussions.
Yeah.
And trust my building in their hands and be okay with them making occasional mistakes. Somewhat happens.
Yeah.
And did I miss anything?
Yeah, that's right.
Business thinking, you said.
It's a business relationship. There's more to an architect than just the design. And a lot of the world focuses just on what the design is. And they seem to think that design is somehow indicative of the quality of the person behind the service. That isn't the case all the time. There's plenty of nice guy out there who's very famous for what they do, and they deserve that because they've earned it. But there's also a lot of people out there that don't think like business people, don't really care about your budget that much, and kind of look at it like, well, this is all about me. Well, I'm sorry, but if I was spending $80 million on a building, I'd want to make sure that it was all about me, not you. The architect's got to be a guy that you can communicate with. They've got to be reachable. They got to be relatable. You have to be able to count on them. You can't have a guy who's going to call you in 3 days when it's urgent and you left a voicemail 4 days ago. No, you can't do that. And you got to be there. These guys got to be there.
That's true. And I'm going to use that as a segue to go to the construction phase.
Oh boy!
Let's say we've gone through the approvals. We have had that nice, good-looking photo shoot day of ground break with the golden shovels that are very common these days, and an excavator in the background. And a few weeks later, now you start seeing issues on site, which is typical to all construction sites. You deal with site conditions, changes, and obviously the grunt work of construction and actually building it, getting it from paper in someone's mind into reality and making it physical touch, having a physical touch. What are some of the things I should watch out for? What are the right questions I should be asking?
Okay, when you're under construction, it's a major milestone. It's a way to make evidence of a success. Okay, so you've been successful all the way along in getting your approvals. And at some point you've got, if it's a condo that's for sale, for example, you've got 75 to 80% of your units sold and you've got the funding from the bank, et cetera. So this is a major milestone. It should feel like you've reached another plateau of success. You can now see the project is going ahead on site. And so you can see the end game. Patience is the key here. There will be things that screw up. There will be weather that shows up. There will be things that can't be provided on time. There will be products that get delayed. There will be something that comes along and messes with the schedule. Expect it. It's another one of those prepare. And this is when the trust is extended to a larger team now, because it goes from 6 or 8 key people that you've been talking to as a developer to now a much bigger crowd that you're not necessarily talking to every day, including trades, construction managers, all kinds of site superintendents that you don't really know. And you've got to extend that trust to that level next. And your construction manager is now a trusted advisor, and they need to be there with you, and you need to be able to rely on them and have the same kind of relationship you do with your consultant team, because that's essentially what they are. They're consultants. So I think that's the key thing, is to be prepared for imperfection. Be prepared for some kind of compromise. Be prepared for some kind of a schedule delay. It's inevitable. I don't see too many projects where they're delivered earlier than planned. I think those are probably rare. And, and then again, don't be afraid to ask the questions. However, as a developer, you really need to put a boundary around yourself. And that is that if you're the type of person that wants to go out to the site and you've got all your personal protection and equipment on, and you're telling you're telling the plumber what to do, and you're telling the formwork guy, I don't know if I want that wall there, you're in for a world of hurt. You are now getting into the sequence of construction, where you have no expertise and you have no contractual right to be talking to those people directly, So it can be very slippery. If you want to make a change during construction, it can happen. Just use the right channels and let your trusted advisors, your consultant and construction management team, let them tell you how. And that's the best advice I can give, because I've seen it. I've seen people go on site, and I was there on the weekend, and I don't like this, and I never understood why. No one told me this.
Such and such never show up.
No, wait a minute. You've seen that for 2 years. It's been on this floor plan, and it's not. And then you feel like they've been duped or blindsided, and you're saying, no, it's been here forever. And
I think what you just said, like you hit on, I count 3 different things that I find really important. I 100% agree with you. One is be prepared for imperfection. That's a very good way of putting it, because I remember myself even I started as an engineer originally, and I was an engineer. And in the engineering world, when you're calculating and you're drafting, things can be much more perfect than on a construction site. And I had a very hard time transitioning from an engineer's mindset to construction's mindset, where things don't go according to plan 90% of the time. You just adjust as you go. So that's part of the game, and it's really important. And like you mentioned, that especially that for people who are coming from different backgrounds, they haven't been around construction, they haven't been around development. It's a bit of a surprise, and not a good one in most cases if you expect everything to go according to plan. Mm-hmm. That being said, I don't want to give this impression that nothing is under control now, obviously. Everyone has a role, and there are checks and balances in place for things to be controlled. But at the same time, you have to better be ready for the imperfection. So that was number one I got from you. The other one is the boundary and the sequence of operation. And I find that to be extremely important, because as much as I hate to say it, construction has been innovating over the past, call it, decade or less, more so. But at the same time, a lot of things that we do on a construction site are not much different from what we did 20 years ago, or probably people did 50 years ago, right? And the whole thing with the old dog and new trick, it's hard to make changes and not be slapped in the face, basically, right? Yeah. So if you want to make the change, by all means, you have to be ready to pay for it and have to deal with the hardship. So better not to deal with that and try, like you said, go through the proper channels. I guess the last thing was ask the questions. Again, asking the questions. And I have to credit some of the clients that I've had the good fortune of working with, is that sometimes a small question at the right time can save you hundreds of thousands of dollars, but you have to approach it the right way and ask the right person, not necessarily the foreman on site. Mm-hmm. But yeah, definitely we're on the same page on.
Yeah, and be a good citizen, be a good team member, show up with your correct gear. I've seen so many owners that walk through a site with dress shoes and they'll wear a hard hat and they'll think they're okay. Yeah. And meanwhile, everyone that comes to that site every single day is wearing everything: hard hat, safety goggles, a vest, and boots. And they're obeying their rules. And the site belongs to the construction manager or the constructor. It belongs to them. So and they're held liable. You show up on site with this stuff and the Ministry of Labor says, hey, dude, where's your hard hat? You could die out here. They fine the site super personally.
Yep. So it's a personal offense.
So it's not your site. It's your site when we turn the building over to you. Any construction savings on site. Love to hear it. Love to hear it. Okay. Construction savings are net of everyone's time that had to go in to make the chain.
Very true.
This is something that right, consultants suffer from, and we get this often. You should have known. You should have known that I would have wanted to do that, or I wouldn't have done that, or you should have known I wouldn't like that. Nope, we didn't actually. So would you like to change it? Yes, I would. Okay, that's $5,000 from me, $6,000 from that guy, and $40,000 from the drywall trade. So whatever saving you're getting, it's net of all of that. But if it's still a saving, let's do it. Yeah. What's wrong with that?
It emphasizes the value engineering part. Like it's always a good exercise to do that. We want to do the value engineering, but like you said, at the right time and considering everything at the right. I can talk about my position is that I don't want to have to price everything 16 different times because we can't make up our time. Yeah. Like we make up our minds.
You lose the credibility and the trades look at you sideways and they think, oh, these people can't make timely decisions. They're in charge of their own schedule now. They're holding us up.
That opens doors for a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah. The temperature rises, I would say, on a project. As you go through this timeline we're talking about, it's pre-con, it's very quiet, it's cool, it's not a big deal. Then you get rezoning, it goes up a bit. Site planning, it goes up a bit. And you go to market and you're nervous and you're thinking, is anybody going to buy here? That goes up a bit. But at construction, that's it. You're at the peak.
Wait for the last 2 months before occupancy, and then you're going to see what temperature means.
Yeah, which we go at a couple times a year, and every single time the construction team panics, and we keep going, guys, it's the same thing we did 2 years ago. Like, yeah, you're in. And everyone take a big breath. We're at a successful point in the project.
Exactly. By the time you're like 2 weeks out occupancy, you've conquered a lot.
Oh, yeah.
But that being said, in the heat of the moment, it's hard to remember that.
Very.
And the last piece of missing valve or leaking pipe here and there does hurt you a little bit.
Yep.
I want to switch gears a little bit. And what are some bad recommendations or bad hypotheses that are out there that you can think of that either are being promoted by professionals in the industry or are being promoted by non-professionals, let's say, the people who are mass public, they're not in the industry. Can you think of anything that is a bad recommendation or misconception or something that we need to, or a myth that we need to clear up?
Yeah, I think that a lot of these things come from one source, and that is that when everyone comes out of their lane, architects come out of their lane and they say, I think we should go for this. I think we should do this. Oh, he's asking too much money. You're stepping outside your boundary of your expertise, and that is a mistake. So architects do this a lot. And the reason why we get stuck with it is because we see so much. We're typically the first or second person hired on a project, and we're almost the last guy to leave. So you're talking about multiple years of presence on projects where you've seen these things. So you want to share it with good intent. But when you come outside your lane and you start to direct things that are not your expertise, they turn into bad recommendations, in my opinion. Oh, that structural engineer, that floor doesn't need to be that thick. Oh, really? Why don't we call the engineer first and ask him if he has a spare stamp he can lend to you, because you are now trying to be a structural engineer for a living. And likewise, we've seen sometimes when developers will grab your pen and paper and start designing a suite for you. Well, that's okay, but Is it going to meet code? I don't know. Is it cost effective? Maybe. I mean, I don't doubt that for a minute, creativity is not held by the architect. I don't doubt it.
That's very true.
This is a thing that humanity shares. We're all creative in some way. So there's collaboration there. But I think that sometimes when people just come out of their areas of expertise, they start to make more statements than they ask questions. And when you make too many statements, at some point, you've positioned yourself as an expert.
Right.
And
you have to be careful with it.
Yeah. And sometimes we see this arrive. Some trades will come to us and say, we don't do that thing you show on your drawings anymore because one time back in 2018, we got in trouble for it. So we're not doing that. We go, wait a minute. This is standard construction practice. Nope, we're not doing that. All right. We'll listen. What are you thinking? So that's one thing I think is that just people coming out of their lanes is difficult. It's always a team effort. So it has to stay that way from the beginning all the way until everybody goes home and all these people move in. That's ultimately what we're there for, is to make sure that they move into an environment that's safe, it's got value to them, and it's where they can start creating memories as they live their lives.
That's the ultimate goal there, right?
Completely.
So to rephrase or recap what you just said is that if you're the developer, two things. One is it's good to be creative, but at some point you have to curb it and park it somewhere and say, okay, like this is the extent of my creativity in the design process.
Yeah.
And I guess the second thing was that if you have, obviously you're going to have a lot of people around you during this process. It's okay to listen, but at the end of the day, you have to, I'm trying to remind myself of a word that there's a book called Principles, and I think it uses this concept of reliable believability. I think that's the one that they're using. It basically means if you're getting a comment from an architect about structural engineering, it's not necessarily reliable. It's believable, but it's not reliable.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to judge that.
Yeah.
Did I get that right?
No, yeah, it's 100%. I would say that's the fundamental source for most bad recommendations, is these recommendations come in the form of statements. And these statements come from a place where you don't necessarily have credibility. And that's where you really have to be careful. And I think that's true for everybody on the team. The developer has a role and a responsibility to play. Each of the consultants has a role and responsibility. And if we all do our job really well, we'll be like a sports franchise. Everyone's got a specialty in the game and nobody's overlapping with anyone else. And the whole team wins. This is what we see in every sports franchise all the time. The coach is sitting there going, you're a specialist. You're going to do this every single game. And that guy is going to do that every single game. And the minute he comes out of his lane and starts doing your job, I'm going to take him off the floor and put somebody else in. This is what I think is important for teams. But the problem with a lot of teams is they don't start off on the right foot and they don't get unified behind a common goal. And sometimes the leadership is missing. Principals drop out of projects and they leave the project to some juniors and things like that. And listen, when I was a junior, I wasn't motivated the same way I am now. So you got to let them.
That makes sense. And that's part of the job.
You got to let them grow up at a pace that they're supposed to.
And going back to the whole discussion about the municipality and approval processes, if I were to, or if someone were to give you a magic wand and say, Rod, here's a magic wand, you get to change one rule, one regulation, design guideline, or legislation that would potentially facilitate the approval process. Does anything come to mind? Like, what is that? Maybe one or two if you want to be over ambitious.
Yeah, I think the concept of flexibility. And I think that if that word was dropped in a room with a consultant group, with an owner and the municipality all duly represented, and if you could drop in this magical thing that came over everybody, and it was about flexibility, meaning the developer's flexible, the consultant team's flexible, the municipality is flexible in that we have one goal here, let's try to get this done. I think that you would see the timeline shorten. If that was the intent and the goal, I think there's a chance that we could see things happen faster. That's the one thing I would like to see. But it's a two-way street. It's not just oh, those public sector guys, they got to do that. I hear that all the time. Come on, give me a break. You really think they're being that unrealistic? Then don't build there.
Go somewhere else.
You try somewhere else where they're standing around waiting for you to walk in because they have 5 people that are members of the municipality there, and that's it. Everything gets outsourced, and they're surrounded by farm fields. And by the way, good luck getting development through that too, because you got the ratepayers to deal with. But I would say if there was some reasonable flexibility that was offered by everybody in a room, I've seen it go from 0 to 100 miles an hour in a meeting within an hour, if everybody is to be well-intentioned.
So I think the point is let's establish what the common outcome is, what the intent is, which is, I think, if it hasn't been clear to date for everyone involved in the industry that, guys, we need more houses, we need better houses, we need faster approval processes. I guess that's a good intent to have, generally speaking.
Yeah.
And what you were suggesting is that add more flexibility, empower the local decision makers to be able to overrule and make some adjustments as they see fit, and we have to trust them. We have to put some degree of trust into that. Okay, so I guess one more question here before we start wrapping things up is, are you seeing an industry trend that you feel particularly excited about? Or on the flip side, are you seeing an industry trend that you're particularly concerned about, that people should watch out for and say, listen, and this could be a trend in technology, or it could be a trend in the types of the building or the mindset?
Yeah, that's a good question. As construction pricing and land costs have escalated since the pandemic, what I see as a trend is some very creative approaches to getting projects built on budget. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean building less parking or things like that, which are somewhat contentious in certain neighborhoods. But what I mean is all precast. The whole building's precast. And I'm seeing that as a trend recently with a number of our projects that are intended to go straight into rental accommodation. And that's exciting, because if you're doing something that is typically poured concrete into a form, it's wet when it goes in, you can add things to the form that make it look different, so it doesn't look like an industrial warehouse, like texture, color, patterns, things like that. I'm finding that interesting, and that's a recent trend that I've been seeing over the last 6 months with some of our design programs. That clients are coming to us and say, "Guess what? We're all precast." Okay, so I see that one. The one trend that I'm a little bit concerned about is the animosity of, and I guess it's the combative nature of us versus them, the client landowner saying, if I don't get what I want, I'm going to take you to the Ontario Land Tribunal and beat some sense into you. There's certain business sense in that. If you're not being heard and you're being reasonable with your development approach, there should be no reason why we can't get an agreement somewhere for rezoning site plan. But I'm seeing people now, clients saying, we don't care what they say. We're going straight to the OLT. And I'm saying, you realize that's going to cost you like $180,000 to $200,000 and probably 14 to 16 months of your life. And there's no guarantees. There's no guarantees you're going to win. So,
and you're saying you don't want to do that as a standard operating procedure for every single project, basically.
I would think it's a far more expensive proposition than just trying to be reasonable and sit down and work out an arrangement where the pro forma is satisfied, where the city is satisfied, and where the people who really need us, who don't have homes, are ultimately satisfied. And there's a very small group of people in this country that are actually leading the housing solution. The people that we are ultimately trying to get houses for outnumber us like 200 to 1.
Yeah.
It's a pretty, maybe more.
It's a good way of thinking about it.
Yeah, it's a pretty important position that we're in as a group. Private development and the private sector trying to get these things done, including the construction industry as well. Here we are trying to get this country built up so people stay here.
Important.
And we build the future of the country. And I think that's an important mandate, rather than seeing them disappear and go off to the States and everything else. Oh, it's cheaper to live there. And even if they go from here to Calgary, all they do is they take the problem from Toronto to Calgary, because Calgary doesn't have the housing starts that they really need to satisfy their population. They've been under supplied since, I think, 2014.
Wow.
You know, We're undersupplied
I
since
definitely
2010.
I definitely see and hear this whole concern on a daily basis that moving down south of border, it's not a good thing. It's, as a country, it's not something we should be proud of.
No.
I think they're like we should definitely put really emphasis on stopping that trend. One last question here: is there any resource, website, book, online course, magazine that you can think of that would help people educate themselves on the topics that we just talked about, or you use personally to keep yourself educated and updated and on top of trends on a daily or weekly basis?
Yeah, wow. It isn't a single source. There's all kinds of ways to find out about certain topics, but I think just purely thinking selfishly for a moment, I attended a seminar probably about 4 weeks ago, and I was pleasantly surprised to hear that the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada has published what they call the Canadian Handbook of Practice, version 3, online. And their mandate was that, listen, versions 1 and 2 were essentially to be used by an architect in any province to understand what's our job, what are we supposed to do here, all the way along this process. And I was pleasantly surprised to hear that this 3rd edition is all online, and it is intended to show people in Canada and out what an architect is supposed to do for you.
Interesting.
If you're the client. So I think it's a good place to understand more about the architect's role, because a lot of people don't necessarily know. They know what we produce on the surface, which they know people by designs and think, oh, you design this and you prepare blueprints. No, there's no such thing as blueprints anymore. The education is somewhat limited in terms of what the architect's role is. Otherwise, there's a lot of sources for development in general about where things are coming and where they're being proposed. Urban Toronto is one of the websites I pay attention to.
Yeah, it's a good website.
Yeah,
sure.
I like it because it just gives you an overall perspective of where people are proposing projects, how big they are, what they've had to do in terms of sometimes compromise, changing heights and densities and things like that. Apparently, the Ontario Land Tribunal releases I'm not sure what it is and what form. I've not seen it, but I do know that lawyers who are involved in the OLT process typically get these. And what it does is it highlights who's recently been successful or not. And that's a good thing to know in terms of what are my chances. It's 50-50. That's it. You don't have much more than that. But I wish there was a single source. If I was a developer, I would rather not to have done it the way I've done it, meaning, and I'm not a developer, but I've been exposed to enough of it that if I had, I don't know, $50 million sitting in a bank account, I would still, after 30 something years, I'm still not sure I would want to try it. So, as much as I've been,
it's a scary business.
Well, it's just stay in your lane, Rod. But it can be a very risky proposition, and who's going to tell you whether you're doing it right or not? All these guys that we know of from our local environment here that have been in the industry for 40, 50 years, they just did what the people you're talking about did. They just started out, right. And they fell down, they scraped their knees, and they kept getting up again. And I don't know, I heard it in one of the Rocky movies, believe it or not, when he said life is not about how many hits you can take. I think he said something like, it's about how many hits you can take and get back up again.
Yeah, that's true. That's a very famous speech he gave.
Yeah, and I actually love it. I think it's about so many things. Maybe the developers are like that too.
You have to be, I think, and I have to say kudos to many of the developers who are out there that, especially the more experienced ones, that they, like you mentioned something earlier about being emotional and not being emotional essentially in the process. And that's this key skill, and being patient and optimist.
Yeah. Like
I've had the good fortune of working with some developers that inherently, or by experience probably, they became optimists, and you know what? We deal with it. Okay, there's another problem. We'll solve it. We'll find a way.
Yeah.
One of our guests called it to find a back door, trying to get creative and solve a problem.
Yeah.
And go from there. So I very much appreciate your input. Is there any question that I haven't asked you, or any final thoughts before we wrap this up?
I think the overall, it may not be a question that you haven't asked, but I think maybe the overall message I think that I could leave here is crawl, walk, run. Everybody needs to crawl, walk, run. In this industry, if you just think you're going to run and it's your first time, you're going to fall down. Cut your teeth on something that's manageable. When I think it was the Del's Auto guys who were starting out by building houses back in the 50s, they do 3, 4 at a time. But it started with one, that's a crawl.
Yeah.
Don't start with a 10-story building and expect that it's going to go absolutely flawlessly and you'll make millions of dollars. Be careful.
Typically, it doesn't work like that.
No.
That doesn't.
The world finds a way to balance everything out for us.
Thank you very much, Rod. And for people who want to reach out to you, do you want to share with us some coordinates on where they can find you, how they can reach you, and maybe share that with us, and we'll start wrapping it up.
Yeah, certainly. We do have a website, of course, like everybody else on the planet, onespaceunlimited.com. You can go there. You can see things that we have on the boards, things that we have done already. You can get to know our character a little bit. We like to take what we do seriously, but we don't take ourselves too seriously.
Good principle.
And I hope that character shows on the website. We also have a newsletter that we publish, and I think you can sign up for it there too.
And I think you have a podcast as well that I know I've listened to the few episodes, and I'm sure people can find that also on your website.
Yeah, we do our own.
Thank you very much, Rod.
Yeah.
I very much appreciate your time. This has been very insightful. We covered a lot of ground. And I'm really hoping that the new generation of developers that are entering into the market, which have a huge responsibility and a lot in front of them to achieve, and a lot of opportunities as well.
Yeah.
Hopefully they're going to listen and they're going to find this valuable. I'm sure we shared a lot of thoughts that can help people throughout the way. And thank you very much.
You're very welcome. If we help one person, it's been worth it.
I totally agree. That's what we do. One person at a time, one project at a time.
Yeah.
Have a great day, Rod.
All right. Thank you.
Just one last thing before you leave. We've created a document called Real Estate Development Toolbox, which you can download for free from our website at realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. This document is basically the result of us asking our network and our listeners, what is a top tool that you use on a daily basis to keep yourself aware of information that's going on in the industry, the changes, the trends, the technologies, the regulations, and or if you with the tools that you use to make sure that you deliver quality results to your clients and customers, the tools that help you with productivity in what you do, and also any softwares, specialized softwares that you think are useful to share with others. So if you think there are resources that you're using on a daily basis and you would like others to know about them, please make sure to let us know, and we will make sure to include it in the next iteration of this toolbox. Thank you very much, and I hope you find this document useful.